Look, a little bit of face-saving needs to happen, doesn't it, today? The eyes of the world will be on Parliament as the Chancellor steps up to the dispatch box. What do the markets need to see, and what can be done to make sure that as we head into recession, we don't make things worse?
Yes, so in terms of what the markets need to see, actually, to some extent, it's continuity of what they've seen since early October. So mortgages were expected to rise, did rise very aggressively off the back of the mini-budget. Broader lending rates for the government, based on international investors' assessment of how creditworthy the UK was, were at a really quite unpleasantly high level. They've come down since Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak haven't actually done an awful lot, but have just kind of said the right things in terms of indicating the detail of what would come today. Now, to your second part of your question, how do they ensure that things don't get worse? Today is about buying the government time to hope that events outside their control in international energy markets improve. A lot of the pain we'll hear in terms of tax increases and spending cuts will come from 2025 onwards. Now, the cynics amongst us, I'm sure there are none in this room, would say, well, that's in a new parliament. It might be potentially Sir Keir Starmer's problem rather than Rishi Sunak's problem. But they are hoping that the events that have generated this huge cost of living squeeze, principally in energy markets, get better over the next 2 years. So actually, when we come to budgets in 2 years' time, some of those difficult decisions may potentially be U-turned again.
So if they are going to raise tax thresholds and take a lot more people into the 40p tax rate, a lot more people into the top 45p tax rate, are you saying that won't happen, though, until 2025?
Probably won't happen till that point. The reason I say that is...
Which is after a general election.
Yes. I mean, there's a delicate balancing act here. Financial markets are prepared to give the government the benefit of the doubt that it needs to manage the economic cycle. And the economic cycle is slowing. We're almost certainly now in a recession. And therefore, the government has to say it has... What you'll hear a lot about today is medium-term plans, medium-term debt falling as a percentage of the economy. That is the rule which Rishi Sunak is expected to adhere to. And that medium term is normally 3 to 5 years. Now, I'm not saying for certain we won't get those tax changes kicking in today, but almost to the first question around how we don't ensure that things are getting worse, actually, by delaying it a couple of years, you're hoping that the most acute cost of living squeeze is over by the time that inevitable pain comes.
So, essentially, what you're talking about is some of the worst elements of it might be backloaded, as it were, a little bit further down the road. And yet we're hearing this phrase being bandied around about kitchen sinking this budget. Just explain what that means. It's kind of corporate speak. So, although they might be making all these painful announcements now, they might be able to make nicer ones later on, even though the pain's yet to come down the road. Yeah,
so many of your viewers who are familiar with the way that the corporate world works rather than the government world works. A lot of finance directors, chief executives who come into a company afresh, they instruct their management teams to kitchen sink all the bad news, such that they're then upgrading estimates, making things not just sound better, but actually their financial data improving quarter on quarter, year on year. That's pretty well understood in the city and across the private sector. I suspect the government will take the same approach because it has one eye on an election at the end of 2025, potentially where it wants the news cycle to be getting progressively better. There are warnings from history, though. John Major had a rapidly improving economy in the mid-90s. He got no reward in 1997. George H.W. Bush in the United States, recovery from the early 90s recession, but by 1992, Bill Clinton already had the momentum. He'd lost that election. So it's an election strategy. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll work.
On gas, can I just ask you on energy?
Yeah.
Because this is the bulk of what he's going to be confirming today.
Yeah.
Gas prices are falling on the international wholesale markets. So can you explain why we don't get the benefit of that for quite some time? So the delivery right now and over the next month or so is at a very, very low level. And actually, if we were just talking about providing gas to UK households in November and early December, we would be getting the reward instantaneously. But the energy companies need to assure forward buy for the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And those prices haven't come down nearly as much because the shipments of liquefied natural gas from around the world are providing a glut now, but we don't necessarily have the storage to keep those for the next 18 months. So the price remains high, and the reality, therefore, is that when we're looking at what the energy price
guarantee will be that Jeremy Hunt will unveil today, talks of £3,000 rather than £2,500, is a reflection of what is going on the latter part of the energy curve, not the front end of the curve, where you're right, prices have come down a long way.
OK. Well, let's bring in Alice Denby in all of this, because that's the kind of the economics of it and what we can expect. But obviously a lot of politics at play, and they have to appease certain wings within their own party. We've also already seen quite vocal opposition to some of the ground laying that the Chancellor has been doing, from Esther McVey, for example, in the Commons yesterday. How much of a difficult path is the Chancellor treading politically today, do you think?
I think the difficulty the Chancellor has here is that a different Prime Minister a couple of months ago was saying that we were in a position to be cutting taxes. So people are rightly going to ask, well, is this a political choice you're making, or is it your party that has made the situation so much worse? And if you look at the polling, many voters blame the Conservatives for this hole we're in, and people are going to be looking at this government and saying, well, you're making me poorer.
I just want to ask Simon on that point, because the OBR are going to be publishing their analysis at around 2 p.m. today, which will be absolutely crucial, because up till now we don't really know how big this black hole is. But on current estimates, how much of this black hole is attributable directly, do you think, to Trustonomics? I've read estimates of around 30 billion.
I would say smaller than that, actually. If we'd been having this conversation, and we did a few weeks ago, the number today, which is probably going to be 50 to 55 billion, would probably have been about 75 billion. So it's come down by 20 billion. But the additionality versus what it would be if Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng hadn't unveiled the budget, relatively small. I would suggest somewhat lower than that. And this is just, if you like, a reflection of events in energy markets around the world have led to these difficult decisions, plus also the blowback it has on the growth of the economy. The economy, if you take the Bank of England's assessment, is going to shrink for the next 8 quarters for 2 years. That makes that medium-term debt rule we were talking about, debt as a proportion of the economy. If you get that ratio, if you get the size of the economy falling, debt needs to come down even further. So it's really the degradation in growth that is doing a lot of this driving force, rather than the events of late September.
I mean, you're going to get the Office of Budget Responsibility report, a lot of controversy that they weren't involved in that Trust mini-budget. They thought they were being very clever, didn't they? Call it a fiscal statement. We don't need the OBR.
Yeah.
How much importance does the city, to the markets attached to what the OBR will say at 2 o'clock this afternoon? So
I'm really pleased you asked me this question, because the OBR will be wrong. The Bank of England will be wrong.
Glad you said that.
I will be wrong. You'll be wrong.
Right.
Economic forecasts are always wrong.
Yes.
But famous US economist J.K. Galbraith said all economic forecasts are wrong, but some of them are useful.
Right.
And that is the important thing for your viewers to remember, is that the institutional signalling of getting the Office for Budget Responsibility to model this stuff, even though it will be wrong, is important for financial markets, because it suggests that you are prepared to have your homework marked. And that is an important signalling device for people who are looking at the real strength. The government bands around this phrase of the UK being world-leading on almost everything. But what it is world-leading on, and this is really important, is the institutional checks and balances we have. Judiciary, rule of law, the independent institutions. You start to degrade those, and the UK becomes a less attractive investment destination.
OK. Alice, back to you in all of this. Lots of people calling it austerity 2.0. Is this going to be the way that, I suppose, lots of people see Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak from here on out? Some people calling them the Doom Brothers. I mean, they've got an unenviable task in trying to sell austerity 2.0, haven't they?
Yeah, and as I say, I think they're going to be keen to talk about how this is caused by global factors. It's Putin, it's energy prices. But are people at the next election going to give them credit for that? Or are they going to say, well, you've been in power for 12 years and I'm coming into an election in a worse financial position than I was 5 years ago? And I also feel like he's going to try his best to make sure that these tax rises fall on the wealthiest people. But he's also doing it in this kind of stealthy way by, say, freezing the thresholds, which does drag a lot more people into, and lower earners into paying higher taxes. And then there's this kind of giving with one hand and taking with the other, so rumours are he's going to raise the living wage. Well, fine, but then if you're paying more tax on a lower income, it's not going to help. So I think the political balancing act here is really difficult. But as Simon says, I think he's going to try his best to make sure a lot of those consequences are felt further down the line rather than immediately. So he's hoping, as you say, that the spending cuts won't have to actually happen. They'll just have to be signalled at to give the markets confidence.
We should say, Simon, as well, we're not in splendid isolation here, are we? Economies across the world are having exactly the same problems. Inflation, problems with food prices. And how do we compare? We've got inflation now at over 11%, highest for 40 years. Is that especially high for Europe or America, United States?
No, not really. The UK is middle of the pack. Once you start to adjust for energy composition, and so much of this is driven by particularly exposure to gas in the energy mix, the UK is modestly higher in terms of its headline inflation rate. But across Europe, you see higher inflation rates in the Netherlands and Spain. There are comparable countries where inflation rates are higher. The question really is whether, as it comes down at the pace that passes through that benefit to consumers so they feel better off in real terms. You're starting to see that come down very rapidly in the United States because, if you like, they let inflation rip. By putting in the energy price guarantee, the energy price cap, you are moving the pain slightly to the right or later on. But that also may mean that the pain goes on a little bit longer. So you help people in the short term, but actually the benefit, and you mentioned 5 minutes ago, the falling gas price, comes later for individuals. It's a delicate balancing act, but actually so much of this is global. This is the element that I do have some sympathy with the government, where they're trying to make the case that the UK is not unique in the challenges.
The Chancellor at the weekend saying the USA is raising taxes by $800 billion. There's higher inflation in the Eurozone in countries like Germany and Italy. And Germany is predicting a bigger fall in GDP than we are here in the UK.